Chris Wilson is Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. He joins us today to discuss U.S. Mexico economic interdependence. Chris, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, John. Good to be here.
I can't avoid this before we dive into the subject matter. Just your take on the current status of U.S. Mexico relations, given all of the tumult in the early days of the Trump administration.
I mean, things got really on edge, and there was a concern that they might have been spiraling out of control for a few days around the time when President Peña Nieto canceled his visit to the United States to visit with President Donald Trump. Since then, the leaders have spoken by phone. The foreign minister of Mexico has been here to meet with our new Secretary of State. There's been a bit of a cooling off, a little bit less talk of Mexico paying for a wall, which is actually a very specifically incendiary, thorny issue for Mexico. And so I think there's an effort underway to make sure things don't get tipped over the edge. That said, there's a lot to be done and real issues that will be tackled along the way, and how those play out will be everything.
Well, we're going to now shift gears and talk about economics as if none of this is happening. No, of course, that's not true. Tell me about the project that the Mexico Institute is undertaking. I know you're working on a series of essays that will eventually be collected.
Yeah. So I've been particularly working on a project called Growing Together: Economic Ties Between the United States and Mexico. And we began it last summer, really, as we saw the way that the campaigns were shaping up, the way that Mexico had become a central focus in the campaigns, and the way that, in particular, economic issues between the two countries had been a focus. You know, there's really, I think, the sense of economic insecurity among many people, many working and middle-class people in the United States. And a lot of that's around their encounter with globalization, issues of trade, issues of investments, moving, outsourcing factories, moving abroad, things like that. And, we felt like, the way that Mexico had become a symbol of globalization and, people's encounter with the world.
Often in the negative.
Very much so in the negative during the campaign is what happened. And so we felt a need to respond to that, a need to put forth what we think is actually a much more positive story, but also in a way that recognizes some of those challenges and tries to address them.
My next question contains a bit of a confession. In that, I think until I began interviewing you over the course of years, I didn't have a full appreciation of the depth and scope of interdependence, economic interdependence between these two countries. Yeah. Do I reflect the average American in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this has been something that is, it's very difficult to sort of get out to a mainstream audience. And it's because Mexico in some ways is an easy target in political conversations. But in contrast with that, the economic relationship is very deep. There are 5 million jobs in the United States that depend on this relationship between the United States and Mexico. We actually build products together rather than just building them separately in one country or the other and then selling them to one another. And that has real implications in terms of policy and the way that we can try to improve the situation for a working class or middle class American.
The complexity also in that you take things like imports from Mexico that contain a significant amount of U.S. content. Can you explain how that happens, how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the sort of the key sort of reframing pieces that is needed to understand, the way forward in the U.S.-Mexico economic relationship is that, just as I said, we don't simply trade goods, we build them together. And so as parts are moved across the border, sometimes multiple times during the course of production, both the United States and Mexico are contributing value to products that are ultimately sold in the region or exported to the rest of the world. One of the things we just found in our recent research is that actually half of all U.S.-Mexico trade is made up of these movements of parts and materials. And so it's just an incredible way in which Mexican factories are feeding U.S. factories and farmers and sort of producers are feeding Mexican production. And it means that we experience growth and recession together. It means that when one country improves its productivity, it actually improves the competitiveness of the other country. And in this situation, this current political environment, a key finding there is that it means that if we put a big, import tax on goods coming from Mexico, not only would we be harming Mexico, but we'd be actually harming ourselves in a significant way.
So if you're a visual learner, it's not a straight line. You should picture a zigzag back and forth across the border.
Precisely.
The thing you just said last about trade barriers and the implications for each economy, the posture of the Trump administration is that it's been a bad deal for the U.S. and we need to fix that. And by getting tough with Mexico, we will do that. It sounds like you're telling us something different will happen.
Yeah, well, it depends on what happens going forward. I mean, that's the key here,
specifics.
is that the specifics can change everything. The idea that you can renegotiate NAFTA and do a better job is totally reasonable. This is an agreement that was negotiated 25 years ago. The world has changed immensely in the interim. We didn't all use smartphones every day. Businesses didn't connect with their buyers via virtual platforms, and it means that small businesses are now able to get involved in trade in a way that was is much simpler than it used to be. All that can be reflected in an update or a renegotiation of NAFTA. In addition to that, we have to admit that there is this challenge in middle class, working class America. Their real median wages have been relatively stagnant, slow to grow. And so how can we address that? We have to be honest about the causes. The biggest cause is automation, the use of technology to improve productivity, meaning we need less workers to make more stuff. The second biggest cause is trade with China in terms of our manufacturing losses. That actually tends to be a much bigger shock to the U.S. economy in terms of the growth of that trade than Mexico-U.S. trade ever was. But nonetheless, there are some factories that have closed up shop in the United States and moved to Mexico. So let's be honest about that and then say we need a real policy response to those issues.
Is it possible to quantify that, Chris, in the sense that the China factor, the technology factor, or the automation factor, what percentage of this is related to our trade with Mexico?
Yeah, some great research coming out of Ball State University in the last couple of years shows that about 87% of it is technological advance, leaving about 13% to trade. Another set of studies on U.S.-China trade that are really high quality recently suggest maybe it's a bit higher percentage for trade overall, but that almost all of that trade section is related to China. When they sort of did their same test that they found significant job losses related to U.S.-China trade in manufacturing, they find that nothing of the sort in terms of U.S.-Mexico trade. And so what we actually find is that when the U.S. economy is growing, investments in Mexico grow. When a U.S. company goes and makes investments in Mexico, and so they're growing employment in Mexico, they're actually, on average, simultaneously growing employment, growing research and development spending, growing U.S. exports. And so we're having all this growth that's happening together. And why is that? Well, it's because we make things together. And so when you have growth in a new factory in Mexico, well, they're going to buy inputs from the United States. That's how the production system works. And so it's this mutually beneficial relationship. And so we need to start from there as we take those next steps.
The most disturbing aspect of what you describe is that we're trying to fix a problem by focusing on the wrong thing.
I think that is, largely the case. And so, from perspective of, someone working at a think tank, the thing to do there is to say, well, there is a real set of problems that are maybe at the root of it. I mean, there's a misdiagnosis at sort of a mid-level, a fundamental issue that's real in terms of a sense of economic insecurity and a need to improve, manufacturing employment and things like that in the United States. But let's try to address the fundamental question as opposed to this mid-level question, which is how do we fix the worst trade deal ever negotiated, or how do we sort of make Mexico less of a competitor for us? Well, Mexico is not a competitor for us at the deepest level. Of course, we compete at certain levels, but in the deepest level, we're in it together. And so if we want to do something like decrease the U.S. deficit, well, let's do that together with Mexico, because if we can compete, if we can produce in the most competitive way, we'll increase exports from all of North America.
Final quick thought for now, because we'll have a series of discussions as we dive deeper into the work that you're doing. But for people who are interested in doing that on their own, can they find these essays online? Where can they get more information?
Yeah, absolutely. All of this research is on the Wilson Center's website. So wilsoncenter.org/Mexico will get you to our homepage, and you can see all of this research showing up there.
You can thank me for that plug later. Thank you, Chris, for joining us. Always interesting. And I love the way that you unpack these issues for us.
Thanks very much, John. Appreciate it.